Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Gurus, where every Friday we explore stories of international business and speak with industry leaders operating around the world. I'm your host, Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International. Thank you for joining us. As most of you know, we start each podcast with a running segment called Faux Pas Fridays, where we explore a funny blooper or mistranslation that does not quite convey the professional image that your organization wants to project. And since today's guest has been in the fitness industry for many years, and since athletes tend to go to bars after their sports matches, I thought I would reprise a blooper that was done a few podcasts ago, but is totally appropriate. And it was a sign in a Tokyo bar that said in English very simply, special cocktails for the ladies with nuts. So today's guest is Gene McCarthy. Gene has had a very varied career in both the athletic and outdoor industries, holding executive and C-suite positions at Nike, Jordan, Under Armour, and Rebook, as well as Timberland and Merrell. His most recent role was as president and CEO of ASICS Americas. He is currently the board chairman of Foot Balance Systems of Helsinki, Finland. Gene has served on several boards and has been a speaker at various universities and colleges, including USC, Marquette, Princeton, and the business schools of both Columbia and Cornell. Welcome, Gene. I'm delighted that you've joined us.
Well, Philip, I'm happy to be with you, and I loved your little blooper in the beginning there. That made me chuckle.
Yes, very appropriate, especially for athletes and everyone for that matter. So before we dive in, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about your personal background and how you grew up and how you gained your global experience.
Yeah, first of all, I'm happy to be here, and it's exciting to be a part of the Global Gurus. But let me give you, I'm an Irishman, so I have to do storytelling on my background.
Of course.
I grew up in the Bronx, New York, one of five kids, the oldest of five kids. And of course, we had two parents, and do the math, we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. When I was 13 years old, I happened to see a cover of a magazine called Sports Illustrated. And there were two guys on the cover, a very vivid picture of two guys running. And I was just taken aback by the fact that A, it wasn't a baseball player or a football player. And B, I was really interested in these sinewy muscles and the grimacing faces. I read the article, and it was about the Dream Mile. And at the time, in 1954, a guy named Roger Bannister was the first person to break the 4-minute mile. So it had always become this very important milestone. So at 13 years old, I read the article twice. I told my family at dinner that night, I made the declaration, I am going to break the 4-minute mile. Of course, it was met with eye rolling and, oh, that's good, honey, good luck. Right. 8 years later, I'll fast forward. I was about to graduate from Fordham University. Fordham University is in the Bronx also. I could have gone to 100 colleges on scholarship, but I chose one 8 miles from the house. I still don't know why. And but I didn't break the 4-minute mile. I ran 4 minutes and 3 seconds. So I did something that young people don't do today. I wrote a letter. That's a paper and a pen. And I wrote a letter to one of the guys on the cover of the magazine. And he actually wrote me back. And I said, I always wanted to break the 4-minute mile. I'm 3 seconds away. He invited me to move to Florida. His name is Marty LaCourie, and he owned a chain of sporting goods stores, but he also was one of the greatest runners in the world still. And he said he'd help me with my dream. So if it weren't for that magazine cover, I don't think that I ever would have gone to college, because we couldn't afford it. And it wasn't something that I was the first person in my Irish immigrant family to go to college. But because of that magazine, I got a free education. I got to see the world, both as an athlete and then in business. And it began for me a almost 40-year career working for some really fun athletic brands that I'm sure everybody's heard of. If anybody looks at my profile and they see all the companies I've worked for, I guarantee you every listener owns a pair of shoes by one of those companies I've worked for. So that's a little bit about my background.
That's fascinating. And you're probably right about every listener owning a pair of shoes by one of the companies you worked for. Tell us a bit about the sports fitness industry, or I guess the shoes industry. It's more the sports shoes industry. and how you got into that and what your experiences were.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was a fairly good runner. I made the U.S. Olympic trials, made the semifinals. And so I was sponsored by Nike at the time, which was, a relatively fledgling company. It began in 1972, and this is only 8 years later. And I had a relationship with them. And then when I stopped running after the 1980 U.S. Olympic trials, a guy from Nike who I used to work with called me up and he says, "Hey, do you know anybody with a marketing background that would like to be a tech rep in the state of Florida?" And I'm like, "Yeah, me. I live in the state of Florida and I have a marketing background." So I got my first job with Nike, and it was probably a pivotal role for me because throughout the next 40 years, I used that as my, it's my base for how I view things, because I was out in the market and I was not only espousing the wonders of this new brand called Nike, but I was also taught to listen and to look. And I've used those skills ever since. But that's how I started in the industry. My career with Nike went on for 21 years. The last 4 years were probably the most impactful on my life. And that was when the Michael Jordan brand actually became a brand. Instead of just a collection of shoes, it was its own P&L. So there was a lot of work to do there, but it was like, having a startup, but having a lot of dad's money at the same time. So, but that's how I got into the industry.
That's fascinating. And then how did you come to work for the different shoe manufacturers?
Yeah, that's interesting. When you're 47 years old, I was at the time, and I decided to leave Nike with 4 kids. I wanted to know if it was me or if it was Nike. Nike at that point was $12 billion, and it's 47 billion now. And I wanted to know if I was really any good, or was it just that I worked for a good company? So I got an offer to work at Rebook, and the main competitor. And Nike was so happy for me, Philip, that they gave me a going away present of 2 days in federal court because I got sued because of my non-compete, the first of my 4 non-competes that I had to sit out on in my career. So that'll give you an idea how contentious the industry is. But as I went from brand to brand, I was always recruited to go to those brands. I never sought the employment. And at each stop, I learned a lot about the industry we were in, not just about the brands that I work for. So it's an invaluable education. There's a difference, Philip, between experience and tenure. If you're at Nike for 21 years, that's called tenure. If you work for Nike, Reebok, Under Armour, and ASICS, for example, that's called experience. So I'm blessed to have had all those experiences.
That's fascinating. And is there much difference? This sounds ignorant, but to me, a running shoe is a running shoe. And obviously they all do the same basic technology to make athletes run faster. So how did these brands distinguish themselves in some way? Were you involved with the branding issues and then the globalizing issues as well, the internationalizing?
Yeah, it's interesting. You use the word internationalizing. There's a difference, at least in my book, between global and international.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think there's a lot of commerce that's done between countries. And I would put that under the category, at least in my industry, of being international. Global is this idea of being a big brand. So maybe, and I always denote the difference between a brand and a company. So you're right. When I went to the factories and I ran the product engines at both Reebok and Under Armour. When I went to the factories, on different floors of the factories, other shoe companies, Nike or Saucony, other shoe companies were being built in the same factories. Are the shoes basically all the same? Not really. Some shoes are better than others, but what separates the pack is the marketing. So I would always describe Nike, for an example, as a marketing company that makes shoes on the side. And and then my last run was at ASICS, where they made beautiful product, maybe some of the best built product in the world. But they never really got the idea of branding. So that's a big thing that separates them. And and there's other little things too. When you get down into the design element of product, it's not just the aesthetic and the visual and the optics of a product. It could be something subtle, like the use of color or a logo, or it's interesting. All shoes, at least in the athletic industry, they all have names. It's like they're a friend of yours, you know. So I've been involved in a lot of those. I think probably the best branded company I ever worked for was Air Jordan, because it was basically named after a guy. In the rest of the industry, it's not. So that to me is a Halley's Comet. There'll never be another brand like that. There hasn't been one like that in a long time. But branding makes you global. Companies become a little bit more international. So there's nothing wrong with being an international company. But I'll give you an example. Global is this. You go to Disney World, and I'm sure you've been, Philip, maybe even recently. You look like a fun, youthful guy. There's a ride called It's a Small World After All.
Right.
And all you do is get in a boat, and it takes you through, and it's the same song over and over again, but the language changes. And that's what a global company is to me, is that it's the same song all over the world. It's just tweaked to a language that is understandable by people in their locale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. That's a very interesting distinction. In the language business that I'm in, I run a 30-year-old translation company. Globalizing and internationalizing are very misused terms. And if you ask someone what they mean, you know, each person has a slightly different definition. And we get, not so much anymore, but we used to get emails, can you globalize our American brochure for Mexico? And yes, what you mean is, can we translate your brochure into Spanish and acculturate it for Mexico? Yes. But right. Globalizing and internationalizing have other meanings in the language business involving everything from currency and colors and naming and date formations and you know, whether you're using terms that are international, like do you say football for soccer or do you use soccer for Americans? So, you know, there are many different issues like that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think when I traveled, I took it upon myself to learn those notable differences. Now, I didn't immerse myself in every cultural, you know, idea that, you know, another country had, but if I were in the UK, for example, I always referred to it as football, never soccer, you know, and I didn't do that so I could speak their language. I did it to honor my hosts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very wise to do that. It's a great international lesson right there. Tell me about some of the most successful ventures that you've had, or the great launches that you've done.
Well, I'll tell you, the one that's the most outstanding is what I just mentioned earlier, was Air Jordan. Mm-hmm. And here's what happened. This is going back to 1998 or 1999. The brand actually wasn't doing well. Many listeners who follow Michael Jordan or the Jordan brand wouldn't believe that, but it wasn't doing well. He had just retired. And a handful of us were charged with, how do you get this brand back on track before we folded the tents? And we realized that when you have great momentum, it's like a rocket ship ride, but a rocket ship takes a longer time going up than it does coming down. So when you lose that momentum, you really have to put your foot on the brakes. So we introduced a product line, and my idea, going back to my days as a tech rep 20 years earlier and wandering all over the state of Florida and looking and listening, I didn't go to the store owners with this new product line. I went out to the kids in the street, went to all the major markets and visited with the kids. And they didn't like the line, but they kept asking for this one shoe that had been released about 10 or 12 years earlier. So when we decided to re-release that shoe, which gave birth to this whole, you know, sneaker collectors thing that goes on now, I brought it back out to those kids and I said to them, hey, I'm going to show you something, but I don't want you to tell anybody that I showed you this, because if you tell anybody, I'm going to lose my job. So I would show them the shoe. And the idea was for them to tell everybody. It's like telling a kid, don't spill your milk, right? So the next thing you knew, with absolutely no marketing, there were kids lined up at stores all over America, you know, waiting for this shoe, the doors to open to their favorite store so they could go buy this shoe. And it was in limited supply. It's the oldest trick in the book, supply and demand. I called it evaporation versus liquidation. You want anybody who makes a product out there or sells a product, you want it to evaporate, not liquidate. Because in my business and a lot of businesses, you don't make money on what you sell, you lose money on what you don't sell. So that gave birth to this, not just regenerated a brand that was struggling at the time, but what it did was it came up with a new practice that every other company tried to mimic, and they still do today. So that was really important to me.
That's fascinating. It's a great philosophy and great way to do it. And of course, you didn't lose your job. But that was the best part as well. Did you take the brand international right away, or was it primarily domestic?
So that's a great point, and it's one of the big lessons I've learned, and I still think it's an important lesson. We, in our bravado, after 2 years, we had great success with the brand. We decided to go to Europe. And we figured, okay, let's just unleash this wild animal in all these other countries. They're going to love it. They hated it. They hated the idea of it. And it goes back to your comment too about, is it football or is it soccer? Basketball is not as popular in other parts of the world as it is in America. It's now popular. The NBA has globalized itself, and I think they've done it very shrewdly and strategically. Yeah. But we got the door slammed in our face in a lot of places. But the second lesson I learned was, again, forget the store owners. We went and tried to meet the cool kids in each market and tried to get them to be ambassadors for our product. And it would take time. You have to crawl before you walk. Nike used to call it in the olden days, word of foot advertising. So we gave out free shoes to kids, and it create a spark, but it took several years before it took off. I also learned that many companies, if they go someplace and they try something and it fails, they give up. And that's the one big lesson I learned at Nike. No, that means you keep trying until you get it. And so it took a while, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't like instant success. It's also it's something I've seen with a lot of Americans when they go overseas to any country, is that they tend to think if they love something, then my God, the rest of the world must love it too. So it's a little bit of the blinders on Americans, so it doesn't work that way. I think I've learned over the years that you have to start as small as you can and consider it planting a seed, as opposed to hoping you can go up. Look, one of my favorite stories is Ralph Lauren and how they grew their business in China. Ralph Lauren, at first they were smart. They set up distributors, right? And carefully selected them. It was a lot easier back then, 25, 30 years ago. But then ultimately, as the brand grew, Ralph took it back under their own control. But it took decades to get the brand to just, get to a place where it was not only popular and iconic and successful, but profitable.
I didn't realize it took decades. That's fascinating. And that's a wonderful lesson, especially in China. Americans have a very short fuse and very short time, time frame. We want instant results in this quarter or this week or this month, whatever. And the Chinese, with their 5,000 years of history, know that they can just wait things out, and that most Westerners, especially Americans, don't have the patience to wait for decades for something to turn profitable. So it's wonderful that Ralph Lauren had that vision and that tenacity to do so, to stay.
It's the tenacity. You bring up a really good point. Two things that, really strike all Americans is, one is instant gratification takes too long. And in America, attention is the scarcest resource. So if we don't get rich quick, if we can't click our heels and snap our fingers and win the lottery today, it's considered an utter failure. But it's really not. You have to be patient and take the time.
I love that. What did you say? Instant gratification takes too long?
Yes.
That's great.
I mean, think about you when you would try to hail a cab in Manhattan. 15 years ago, there was no time frame on it. You just hope you get one. Now people get upset when they go on their app and get an Uber and it says it's going to take 8 minutes. People are so upset they have to wait 8 minutes. So
yes. Yeah, how dreadful, I know. And what would actually people do for 8 minutes besides Perhaps take out a magazine or a book or read something or read emails or whatever. Yes.
Look at their phone.
Look at their phone, exactly. As you've taken your various athletic shoe brands global, what kind of experiences did you have in different parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the one thing that's to note, and this is probably true of any industry, in the athletic industry, even though the industry has set standards and timeframes and timelines, and there's certain sports, et cetera, every company runs differently. You know, New Balance, which I'm a huge fan of up in Boston, they're privately held, so they have a different way of doing business. Brooks Shoe Company, which is up in what state of Washington and right outside Seattle, they're owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett. So they have a different business model. Nike, Reebok, Under Armour are publicly traded companies. So you're at the mercy of, you know, pleasing analysts and shareholders every 4 quarters. So having that is almost a restriction on how you do business, or maybe not a restriction like New Balance might not have. It tends to drive how you go about, you know, getting into other markets outside of the U.S. I will tell you that when I joined ASICS in 2015, there was a distributor model. So the United States was a wholly owned subsidiary of ASICS, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a Japanese company. And Canada, Mexico, and all of South America were not. Well, actually, Brazil was a wholly owned subsidiary. So there was third-party distributors. And when I went down to meet these third-party distributors, or up Canada, I realized that they did things their way, as opposed to follow at least, you know, the branding ideas of the parent company. And they were very proud that they knew more about their market than you did. Well, that's good. You should know more about the market than I do. But what I also realized, we weren't getting anywhere. We were just selling stuff as opposed to expanding the brand. So I had to change 6 distributors: Mexico, Canada, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, and bring them into wholly owned subsidiaries. And the first thing I did was, rather than tell them how it should be done, I wanted them to do it the way they wanted to do it, but I just wanted them to know where the swim lanes were and where the barriers are. So my attitude, my point of view is really, you can bring a strategy to a foreign country, but you need to surrender and relinquish the tactics to the professionals that you've chosen in each of those markets. It sounds hard. You'll sleep with one eye open. You'll worry about it. But if you pick the right partners to join your brand, they will ultimately do the right thing. So you can have the strategy, but you need to relinquish the tactics.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's very much what other guests have echoed also. And what we don't have in this, well, it's not true. I'll say it, and it's not totally true. In the United States, you can do business informally with anyone with whom you have not even met. You can be in San Diego and call someone in Penobscot, Maine, and just order something, and you know it happens. But in most parts of the world, actually, Latin America, certainly the Middle East, Europe, Asia, Africa, certainly East Asia as well. What's critical is trust and rapport, and to make sure that you're working with an agent, a distributor, employees, whoever they are, where you trust that they will do what ultimately the mission is, but they may do it in a totally different way than you do it, than you're accustomed to doing it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I'll give you an example. When I was at Under Armour and they had launched Footwear, it's an apparel company by nature, competing against footwear giants, but they launched Footwear, and then I came in because the first launch was not a success and they needed to relaunch the brand, which was the biggest undertaking of my career. The first thing I did, aside from rebuild the team and replace 75 people out of 104, is I went to my partners in China, and I called them my partners because, and what I didn't realize until I got there, is that some of my predecessors didn't call them partners and didn't treat them like partners, and it was way too transactional. So on my very first visit, I didn't go on a business trip. I went to go and meet them, let them get to know me, and me get to know them. We didn't talk about, what the next 18 months of orders would look like. We didn't talk about, and I just wanted them to know that I'm a 51-49 guy, Philip. So what that means is I'm going to be 51% my company, whatever name company here, right? Whether it's Nike, Adidas, whatever, I don't know. But I'm going to allow you on the other side of the table to be 49%. And occasionally we can flop that. I'll be 49% and you can be 51%. The point being is that 2% difference in the middle, that trough in the middle, that's where you do business. So the closer you are, it's only 2% away, is where you can get things done. And there usually can be mutual outcomes. If you go in and you think you're the big guy and you're going to be 75% you and 25% the others, you're so far away from even getting the other party to listen that you'll never get anything done. And if you do get something done, it'll be incredibly short term and it won't be sustainable and strategic.
That is extremely true. Yes. North American business, especially North American business in general, is very transactional. And the mistake that a lot of Americans make, or a lot of people make, is go and just fly there, talk business, think it's going to happen, and then fly home and all of that. And it very often takes many dinners, lunches, sometimes multiple visits, just to get to know people. And you talk about their families and their, what's important to them, and perhaps books and sports and art and other issues, but never business. That comes later.
Right. And I think that's the way many other companies do business, but I don't actually think that's the way American companies should do business with each other. I do think it's a very noble business practice. And you talk about the Chinese for 5,000 years. The Japanese are the same. They have centuries of a way of doing business, and understanding that and embracing that is important. It doesn't mean you can't do business your way. I mean, my goodness, I've been to Russia and they do business a certain way. And most of the way they do business would be considered illegal, if not immoral, in our country. Right. So it doesn't mean that you have to condone it. You just need to be aware of it so that you can pick and choose your spots. Yes. The same is true in China. There's some things that are very transactional in China by certain Chinese businessmen, but you have to understand the culture of the people you're working with first before you get the permission to do business with them.
Very, very true. Yes. Tell me more about doing business in Russia. What were some of your experiences there? And when were these?
Yeah, Russia is an amazing place. You could see the Red Square and you could see centuries old art in some of these old buildings. And then all of a sudden there's a Louis Vuitton pop-up shop in the middle of Red Square. Right. So it was the biggest contradiction I've ever seen in my life. I did learn how to drink vodka. And I can tell you that the vodka we drink in this country has nothing on Russian vodka, but I can also tell you that sometimes you have to let your Russian opponent win. And there has to be, they choose it's win-lose for them. So sometimes you have to let them win. They respect you more if you stand up to them, because they do like to, bully a little bit and chest thump, at least in my industry. They like to be more powerful than your brand. They do the 75-25 rather than the 51-49. And sometimes you just have to roll over and play dead a little bit, to get what you want. I also realized too that maybe not so much in Russia, but in other countries, the idea of, paying somebody, a gift, as they call it, which is not allowable, by many companies, and certainly, not in international trade, that is not something, even though we might consider that illegal, the other countries, some of them think that that's just a way of doing business. That's how it's done. And you have to know those nuances.
Are you talking about what we would call a bribe, or a physical gift?
Well, you called it a bribe. Yeah, it's a bribe. Well, some of the gifts actually are a form of bribery. But there's been money offered, particularly to the people who represent American companies in the factories. And it really compromises young people who are trying to build their careers, in these factories as expatriates. And, you just have to learn that while that might be daunting and it might look enticing to you, in the long run, it's the worst thing you could ever do. Not only because you could jeopardize your career, but it also sets a different tone for the business relationship.
What about in developing countries where, again, it's in the Muslim world where it is much more common. It is common to give physical bribes, if not, monetary bribes, if not physical bribes. In some countries, like in Japan, for example, when you visit someone, you would normally, you often would bring a bottle of whiskey, for example. Now that's not a bribe per se, it's just like a gift, a token gift. But you're talking about much larger gifts and much larger sums, I presume.
Yeah, so I think the way, if I were to coach a company that was going to expand, globally, and they, again, not only knowing the cultural nuances and honoring them, but if you get into those situations, and they do put you in a compromising position, you just need to step away and take a deep breath and maybe politely end the meeting and come back another day. But that's why companies, like particularly American companies, when they go to developing countries, they use a third party to develop their business. So much like Ralph Lauren did 30 years ago, or maybe it's more than 30 years ago when he established his business in China. You use a third party so you can stay out of these types of conflicts.
That's fascinating. That's great. I know some companies charge, they wouldn't call it a commission, they would call it a consulting fee or something like that, and tack that on to the invoice as a way to obtain their required payment and so forth.
Yeah. Now in America, I'll give you an example of a bribe. And so you live in Philadelphia, and early in my career, I was in sales for Nike, and I was in the Mid-Atlantic area. And there were so many store owners in Philadelphia that didn't have a Nike account that they wanted to have a Nike account. So they thought the best thing to do would be put $5,000 or $10,000 of cash in an envelope and hand it to a 25-year-old sales rep. And,
Wow.
so that's bribery. But I guess the reason I mention it is that it's really short-lived. It's just something to stay away from.
Fascinating. What kind of cultural issues have you encountered? Other cultural issues. You've talked about some, purely business cultural issues, but in terms of other, pure cultural issues, have you?
Yeah, I'll tell you on my second trip to Moscow, you'll notice if you go over there, and this is only about 6 or 7 years ago, that they don't accept American Express simply because it's called American Express. So I was out with one of my colleagues, and we were trying to find something to eat. And the first thing that you try to do is try to find a menu in English, which is almost impossible. And the second thing is you always make sure they have the Visa card sticker in the door window. So we went in, we found a pub, which was lovely. We want to have a couple of beers and then something to eat. And we saw the Visa sticker. We went in and we sat there, and when they realized that we were American, we wanted to now pay for our drinks. And the guy said, cash only. And we point, well, it's Visa. No, today only, cash only. So my colleague was then escorted by 2 guys to an ATM machine, and he was gone for nearly 30 minutes. He said he didn't even know if he had transferred all of his money to an offshore account somewhere. He didn't know because of all the buttons and everything. And while I sat in the bar, I was joined by 2 other guys that sat on either side of me. So, to remind me that I just need to stay put until he came back with cash. Right. So I think there is, and it's a shame, it's increased, particularly over the last several years. There's a disdain, for America and Americans. It's getting a little bit out of control. And it's to a point where the best way to avoid that is not by avoiding the fact that you're an American and saying you're Canadian, like some people do. The best way to avoid that is just to be gracious to the people on their terms when you get over there. Their nuances, their cultural things that are important to them. You mentioned little things like bringing gifts. Every time I went to Japan, I had to bring, fine wine from California. And I always had to buy those sea chocolates in the airport because those were very popular. And that was so well received that if there's any tension or any misgiving, it's automatically gone just by the simple nature of a token of your appreciation for being there.
You were talking about Russia just now, and of course we now, because of the Ukraine invasion, we of course have effectively a boycott of Russia. Does that apply in other countries you've been to, or some similar stories like that?
I think, you got to remember, let's take tourism. So for years, Americans go to other countries, and it fascinates me. I'll give you a New York City example. It fascinates me that Times Square is just populated with tourists from all over the country.
Right.
And then they all go to Applebee's to eat. You think they would go to, a New York restaurant, but it's the same thing in foreign countries. I remember we were doing market trip in Paris, and there were two tourists, and you could tell they were American because they had on baggy cargo shorts and they had fanny packs on, but you could really tell that they were tourists because they were looking for a McDonald's, and they kept asking, French people who probably spoke English but ignored them. And then, but here's the best part about Americans when they go there, not all Americans, of course, but when they go there, they realize they don't understand your language, but Americans tend to think they're deaf too. So they always raise their voice, excuse me,
right.
Like that's going to make it more understandable. So I do think, America has, wonderful, wonderful things that we're all proud of, and we should be. And America has helped a lot of developing countries. But I think it really still comes down to, like I've been saying this whole talk, Philip, is that understanding and respecting the cultural nuances of every country you go to. And first of all, is not only fun to research before you go, whether a businessman or a tourist, but also can open up tons of doors for you.
That's very true. When you opened a new market or went to a new country, how did you learn the cultural nuances? Did you have a staff that told you, or did you talk to people when you arrived?
Yes, so that's an excellent point. When I was going to change every leadership and everything in countries I hadn't frequented in my past, like Chile, Peru, and Argentina, I made sure my first 2 days there, I was with my leader and his team, and not only get to know them, but I asked them to take me around the market and show it to me from their eyes, not from American visiting, Lima or Colombia or something, or Bogota. So, and I think that's really important. And then the other thing too is, I'll tell you a quick little story. When I was named the CEO of ASICS, my son Patrick and I got together in Manhattan. He lived there for a while, and he said to me one time after a couple of beers, he goes, "So Dad, what does a CEO do?" And I like really, like that's a real job. And I said, "Patrick, a CEO does 4 things. I look, I listen, I think, and then I decide." So I think the best way that I've ever educated myself in any of these countries is what I learned in my very first job at Nike at 24 years old, was to be in the marketplace. And there's an old saying, if a salesman were meant to speak, he or she would have 2 mouths and 1 ear. I think the best way to learn is just observe and listen and take it all in. And that's been my greatest guide in any role I've ever had, never mind any country I've ever traveled to.
Yeah, that's fascinating and great advice, of course. Are there any countries that you've been to that have been perhaps shocking or incredibly surprising in how the business is done and what you were expecting?
Yeah, I don't know that I was shocked, because I did take some painful steaks to figure out, how business is done. I think I was, I guess I was more surprised at how willing other countries were to do things on the terms of an American business, which I always thought they never should have been. I think you should do it on your terms. Like I said, it's, you should have local heroes. I'll give you a wonderful story. I went to Brazil, and I was with ASICS at the time, and just a few years earlier, I had been at Under Armour. So I went into this gigantic monument to itself of a store called Under Armour in Sao Paulo. And I was like, oh my God, this is Under Armour trying to shove America down its throat. So in the store, the store was actually 2 stories, but the walls went up 2 stories. And on one wall, they had a picture of Gisele Bundchen, who many people know as married to Tom Brady, the famous model. And I thought that was great because Under Armour had Tom Brady under contract. And here they are. His wife is Brazilian, was completely, she's a national hero in Brazil. But then on the other wall, they had a huge mural the same size of Tom Brady. And this is the blinders that some companies have on that. Nobody in Brazil cares about the NFL or American football. And I think, that's when you can tell. I could always tell a company that goes in there and does it themselves, or a company that goes in there and uses a third party, so that you can maybe, soften the edges a little bit of how you insert a piece of Americana into another culture.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's a great story. Thank you. With all of your international experience, if you could tell your past self some current advice, what would you tell yourself?
First of all, manage my expectations. Second of all, as I mentioned earlier, be a real active listener and make sure you have time to think before you make a decision. And the third one is a really important point. Take in the sights, experience the local culture. I remember I went with a guy from Timberland. It's his first time in Paris, and we're going by the Eiffel Tower in a taxi, and he's on, at the time, his BlackBerry. And I was just livid with him. I said, look, and I do think that's really important, because it's the rest of the world is absolutely stunningly beautiful and has many, many things to offer that you can never find in America. Just look at the old ruins, in Peru. You're sitting at a beautiful outdoor restaurant, very modern restaurant, and you're looking at these ruins that have been there for centuries. It's fascinating to me. So I think American businessmen and women tend to think they need to go there and they need to get home as fast as they can. I get that when you're trying to take care of your family. But I think we built in this mentality that if we actually enjoy ourselves while we're there, we're cheating our company. They think we're having fun and we're not doing our jobs. And it's just the opposite. So make sure you do get to take in all of these wonderful cultural things that we just don't have in our country.
That's great. Yeah. I make a personal distinction when I travel between observing and absorbing. And many people, a typical tourist would observe, of course, and that's fine. But relatively few take the time to absorb the local culture and understand, the nuances, of course, the culture, the food. It's not so much the food, it's the history, the ruins, as you say, the way people think and behave and react, and the language and why, and the traits and so forth. So all of that is, to me, really critical.
I remember, I won't name the company, but I had one company that I worked for where they were a meeting ended abruptly, and everybody walked out of the room because our team showed, our leather shoes. Well, in some countries,
You pointed the soles of their shoes to the other side, right?
Well, in some countries that, if you have that, we use in the outdoor industry, pigskin and other different types of leathers, and they violate sacred religious beliefs. And
of course,
and so you just, if you don't know that before you go over there, you shouldn't be traveling globally and internationally. So, but you're observing and absorbing, I think, is brilliant. I'm going to steal that one from you, Philip.
Please, yes, that would be fine. Yes, and for our listeners who don't know, one should never, even if the sole of your shoe is not made of pigskin, you should absolutely never show the sole of your foot to to someone who in a Muslim country, and probably in Israel as well, in a Jewish country. And Americans tend to cross their legs because we've got so much space here. American men especially cross their legs and point the sole of their foot to someone else next to them. And that's incredibly insulting.
Yeah, you have to learn the discipline and I had to keep reminding myself, because I'm a fidgety guy, to keep both feet on the ground. And I never put my hands, I always put my hands, if they were on the table, they were folded in front of me. I never put my elbows on the table, and sometimes my hands were just on my lap. So it's less imposing. So it is, I found, learning some of those things the hard way, but nonetheless learning them, I found that fun. And that's what I enjoyed about international. Like, for example, you go into a sushi restaurant in America and people are trying to eat sushi, with chopsticks. You don't in Japan. You pick it up with your fingers and put it in your mouth. We had some Japanese people working for us in our Irvine, California office at ASICS. And every time we go to a restaurant in America to show you how they respect the customs, I would see them eat their sushi with chopsticks. And I said to him, "Why do you do that?" And he goes, "I just don't want to insult the Americans. This is the way they do it, so I'll do it the way they do it." So I just found all of those things a lot of fun. And what's also great too is you can pick up not only some of these customs and trades and business practices, but I think it's great to bring home to your family and to your children and to broaden their world, because not everybody is as lucky as the people on this call to be able to travel globally on somebody else's dime, and not only do business, but see amazing things, eat amazing food, and meet amazing people.
Very true. You mentioned about eating sushi with chopsticks. I like asking people when I'm doing a presentation or something, if you're in an enclosed room, point to the restroom. And people will often with their fingers point this way. And I would tend to point, I would say point to the nearest restroom. And I would point, if I knew the layout of the building, I would point straight up and do it this way. Because the restroom, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If you're in a room with Americans and you ask people, point to the nearest bathroom, and they'll point to the nearest men's room or restroom, whatever, and I'll say, no, the nearest bathroom is in the hotel across the street. Bathroom is a very American word. In other countries, it's a men's room, a restroom, a loo, the toilet, whatever one says, the WC. But the bathroom is where you take a bath, obviously. And to use this stupid American word abroad is very confusing. And pointing, of course, I presume you saw this, especially in Latin America. You point with your whole hand, with the palm of your hand, with the fingers together, the palm of your hand, and point basically outward, as opposed to one finger, which is what Americans do, because especially in Latin America, pointing with one finger is extremely insulting.
Mm-hmm. And don't ever make the okay sign in certain countries.
Like this.
Yeah, you don't want to make the okay sign. That's in some countries that's a slander against another person. I'll tell you a cute story about going to Korea, and we were working with a small factory there. And whenever you would go there, you would be always welcome. They'd have a big marquee outside with your names on it, and everybody would line up and greet you when you walked in. And then when lunch came, and these were all working lunches, and keep in mind, they're in factories, so there's nothing glamorous about it. But when they brought lunch in, they would bring in a traditional Korean lunch. But then in order to, please the American guests, they would bring in Pizza Hut, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And here was the cute part. We all would get up, and this is the way I coach my team, and we actually enjoyed eating the local food.
Right.
But they wouldn't serve themselves. Our hosts wouldn't serve themselves until we served ourselves first. Mm. And then after they saw that we were all seated and ready to eat, they would go serve themselves, and they would go straight for the Pizza Hut and the Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I do think we have to remember that America has had a big impact on a lot of these countries in a really nice way too, that we're able to take our big global brands and make them local. I think that's, an important thing that we do, but it's just funny. We didn't feel like we had to eat the Korean fare, but we wanted to, but they went right for the American. So it was just really a cute story.
I'll tell you another cute story. My very first, I lived in Japan as a junior in college, yes. And I lived with a host family in Tokyo. My first day down with my host family, my host mother prepared a breakfast of bacon and eggs and black tea, toast, and butter. And okay, fine. And I said thank you and so forth. And the second morning I came down, it was the same thing, bacon and eggs and toast and black tea, toast and butter and black tea. And on the third day, I finally said, okasan, which is mother in Japanese, it's how you address people. I've been in Japan for 3 or 4 months already. I know how to eat Japanese food. And she looked at me very quizzically and she said, "What do you mean Japanese food? We've been eating this food for 30 years. So yes, American food has become Japanese food. And
yes, I know, right? It's crazy.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Yeah, I've had a good career. And as I mentioned in the beginning, Philip, seeing the world, getting a free education, then having this career and an exciting industry. It's not just about footwear and apparel, and it's not even just about sports. And a lot of times the athletic industry is about pop culture. It really, as the times go, so does this industry. It's an industry that makes itself up as it goes along. There's no college in the land that teaches it. But as I look at young people today trying to start their own brand, I have, and I lecture on this, and I'll leave it for my 4 pillars for starting your own brand. Number 1 would be pick a name, but pick a name that means something, and pick a name that is going to be unique. So Joe Montana and Derek Jeter were born with names that should be used by athletes, and they just sounds natural and normal. On the other hand, in this country, with the 3 of the most iconic fashion brands, you probably wouldn't name your child after: Ralph, Calvin, and Tommy. So names do matter. Look at clever names like Google. Google is now a verb. Look at Uber. I mean, these are names that meant something else now mean something else. So picking a name is important. The second one is, don't try to build a better mousetrap. Try to solve a problem. The best brands come from solving a problem. Uber's a great example. They weren't out there to try to put yellow taxis out of business. They solved the problem. The problem was Johnny has a car, Susie doesn't have a car. Susie needs to get occasionally from point A to point B. Why can't, Johnny or Tommy, whatever, lend his car or take Susie for a fee? So that's how Uber started, with solving a problem. The third thing is, make sure that you build a culture to your brand, because no matter where you go in the world, your brand will have a culture, and it will make itself known beyond words or gestures to your foreign hosts or guests. And Nike has its own culture, and Adidas has a different culture. A lot of it is geographic or whatever, but make sure you have a culture, and make sure that the culture is something that is noticeable, but is also a point of differentiation for you. And the last pillar is the best one. Nobody cares about your brand until they know what your brand cares about. So you need to stand for something. You need to have a point of view. And I'm not talking about being a gigantic bank and planting 1 million, small trees in the rainforest. That cost them $1 million. That's nothing. That's checking the box. Stand for something. And because your consumers all over the world are going to want to know what you believe in and what you stand for. So that's my quick back of the envelope advice for any young entrepreneurs out there, or people who want to build a brand, not only in this country, but any country.
Thank you, Gene. That was absolutely brilliant advice. Greatly appreciate it. And I should add to number 1 about the naming. When you do come up with a product name or a company name and a tagline, absolutely hire a language agency such as ours or any other professional firm to check it in 10 or 20 common languages. Because when you go abroad, you do not want to have invested millions of dollars in your branding only to find out that the brand name does not work. And one of my favorite examples of this is Ford Pinto, which took the Pinto name, which was an American name, and took it to Brazil totally oblivious to the fact that pinto in Brazilian slang means, shall we say, male genitals. Not the best name for a car.
Oh, I know. Listen, I'm sure you have a million of those stories, but that's right. Choosing a name, you're right. Get a language expert. Get you, Philip. You will keep people out of making a big mistake.
Troubles. Absolutely. Well, Gene McCarthy, thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure to gain your insights. And thank you so much for joining us. And this has been Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International. Our website is auerbach-intl.com. And I hope you will join us again next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their wonderful stories of international business.